Russia produces approximately 10 million barrels of oil per day and roughly 700 billion cubic meters of natural gas annually as of 2025. These aren't just impressive numbers. These are the energy flows that powered European industry for decades, heated European homes through brutal winters, and generated hundreds of billions in revenue that made Russia an energy superpower. And throughout 2022-2025, Russia has been systematically weaponizing every drop of this production in what represents the most sustained energy warfare campaign between major economies since the 1970s oil shocks. Let me show you what Russia has actually done throughout 2022-2025, because the cumulative impact of real actions is more devastating than any single dramatic move. Russia didn't need one big nationalization decree. Russia achieved the same result through systematic strangulation of Western energy companies over 3 years. That's been far more effective because it happened gradually enough that each step seemed manageable, even as the total effect destroyed European energy relationships worth $60–80 billion annually. Start with what happened to European energy company investments. Shell had approximately 27.5% stake in Sakhalin 2 LNG project worth several $billion when Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022. Throughout 2022, Russia didn't formally seize Shell's stake. Russia simply made it impossible for Shell to operate by requiring Shell to accept transfer to a new Russian entity under Russian government control, with compensation to be determined later. Shell in 2022 announced it would exit, but faced Russian regulations requiring government approval to sell. Russian government throughout 2022-2023 offered to buy Shell's stake for a fraction of value. Shell had no choice but to accept or abandon investment entirely. By mid-2023, Shell's Sakhalin stake was effectively controlled by Russian entities, with Shell receiving minimal compensation. Multi-billion-dollar investment lost not through single seizure, but through regulatory strangulation. BP held 19.75% stake in Rosneft, Russia's largest oil company, acquired in 2013 for roughly $12 billion. Throughout 2022, BP tried to sell this stake, but Russian regulations required selling to approved Russian buyers at Russian government-approved prices. No buyers stepped forward offering anything close to fair value. BP, throughout 2022-2023, wrote down the Rosneft stake value from 12+'s billion-dollar book value to near zero, recognizing the investment was lost. Not formally seized, but effectively confiscated through regulatory impossibility of exit. By 2024-2025, BP's Rosneft stake exists on paper, but provides zero value or control to BP. Total Energies maintained stakes in Novatek, Arctic LNG 2, and other Russian projects throughout 2022-2025, arguing that maintaining presence served European energy security interests. Throughout 2024-2025, these investments have been progressively devalued as sanctions make operations difficult and Russian partners marginalize Total Energies' decision-making authority. Total Energies throughout 2024-2025 has written down Russian investments by billions, recognizing that even without formal seizure, the investments have lost most value due to sanctions, operational restrictions, and Russian government pressure. Add up Shell, BP, Total Energies, plus OMV, Equinor, Eni, Wintershall Dea, and other European companies with Russian energy investments, and you get roughly $30–40 billion in investments that existed in early 2022 and have been effectively confiscated or made worthless by late 2025 through regulatory and political pressure rather than formal seizure. Now let me explain what Russia did to European gas supplies, because the physical cutoffs are the most visible part of energy warfare. In 2021, Russia supplied approximately 155 billion cubic meters of natural gas to Europe annually, representing roughly 40% of total European gas consumption. This was a decades-long relationship where European industry, power generation, and heating depended on reliable Russian supply. February 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine. Throughout 2022, Russia progressively reduced gas flows to Europe through various mechanisms. technical problems at compressor stations, maintenance that lasted indefinitely, demands for payment in rubles that violated contracts. Each excuse cutting flows further. Nord Stream 1 pipeline, which carried 55 billion cubic meters annually capacity to Germany, was reduced throughout summer 2022 from 100% capacity to 40% to 20% to complete shutdown in August 2022, citing maintenance. Russia claimed technical problems prevented restart. Everyone understood this was political cutoff. September 2022, Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2 pipelines were sabotaged, destroying roughly 100 billion cubic meters annually of pipeline capacity. Who conducted sabotage remains disputed. Russia blames West. Some Western sources suggest Ukrainian involvement. But effect was permanent elimination of major gas route from Russia to Europe. Throughout 2022-2023, Russian gas flows to Europe fell from 155 billion cubic meters annually to roughly 40-50 billion cubic meters through remaining routes, pipelines through Ukraine, Turk Stream to Turkey and Hungary, and some LNG. By 2024-2025, Russian gas to Europe has fallen further to roughly 15-20 billion cubic meters annually, less than 15% of pre-war levels. This remaining gas goes primarily to Austria, Hungary, and Slovakia through Ukraine Transit and Turk Stream, with these countries maintaining dependence despite EU pressure to diversify. This 90% reduction in gas flows from Russia to Europe throughout 2022-2025 represents the single largest energy supply disruption between major economies in modern history. Russia didn't need to announce formal cutoff. Progressive strangulation achieved the same result while maintaining deniability. Let me show you what this meant for European energy prices throughout 2022-2025. Natural gas prices in Europe before Russia's invasion traded around $20-30 per megawatt hour in early 2022. By August 2022, as Russian cuts intensified, prices spiked to over $300 per megawatt hour, a 10x increase in 6 months. European households throughout 2022-2023 faced energy bills 2 to 3 times higher than previous years. European industry faced costs that made production uneconomical. Chemical plants, steel mills, fertilizer manufacturers, energy-intensive industries throughout 2022-2023 curtailed production or shut down entirely because operating costs exceeded revenue. By late 2023-2024, prices moderated to $30-60 per megawatt hour as Europe secured alternative supplies, but this was still double pre-war prices. Throughout 2024-2025, European energy costs have remained structurally higher than before Russian invasion due to lost cheap Russian pipeline gas and replacement with more expensive LNG imports. Total additional costs to European economy from higher energy prices throughout 2022-2025 is estimated at $500 to $800 billion cumulatively. Households paying more for heating, businesses paying more for energy, governments subsidizing energy costs to prevent social unrest. This is real money that represents the cost of Russia's energy warfare. Subscribe to this channel if you want continued honest coverage of real energy warfare impacts rather than fabricated crisis events. Now let me explain what Europe did to replace Russian gas throughout 2022-2025 because the response is important context. Europe increased LNG imports dramatically from approximately 80 billion cubic meters annually in 2021 to roughly 150 plus billion cubic meters by 2024-2025. This LNG comes from United States, Qatar, Algeria, and other global suppliers. To receive this LNG, Europe throughout 2022-2025 built approximately 20 plus new LNG import terminals or expanded existing terminals across Germany, Netherlands, Italy, Greece, Poland, and other countries. These terminals, built in record time, allow Europe to receive LNG shipments and convert them to pipeline gas. Europe increased pipeline gas imports from Norway and Algeria throughout 2022-2025. Norwegian gas production increased from roughly 120 billion cubic meters to 125 plus billion cubic meters. Algerian gas exports to Europe via pipelines increased. These alternative pipeline sources partly compensated for Russian losses. Europe reduced gas consumption throughout 2022-2025 through combination of conservation, industrial demand destruction, and fuel switching. Total European gas consumption fell from roughly 400 billion cubic meters in 2021 to approximately 350 billion cubic meters by 2024-2025. This 70 billion cubic meter reduction came from households conserving energy, industries using less gas due to high costs, power plants switching from gas to coal or renewables temporarily, and permanent industrial closures where energy costs made operations uneconomical. Adding up all these adjustments, more LNG, more Norwegian and Algerian gas, reduced consumption, Europe by 2024-2025 has successfully replaced 135 to 140 billion cubic meters of lost Russian supply. The remaining 15-20 billion cubic meters from Russia are vulnerable and will likely be eliminated by 2026-2027 through final infrastructure investments. Let me tell you what this cost European industry specifically throughout 2022-2025. BASF, Europe's largest chemical company, throughout 2022-2023 permanently reduced operations at its main German plant due to high gas costs. Jobs lost. Production moved to US and China where energy is cheaper. Permanent loss of European competitiveness. European fertilizer industry throughout 2022-2023 saw multiple plant closures because fertilizer production requires massive natural gas inputs. High gas prices made European fertilizer production uneconomical compared to imports from regions with cheaper energy. European steel, aluminum, and other metal production throughout 2022-2025 has been curtailed due to high energy costs. These industries require enormous energy for smelting and processing. When energy costs triple, production becomes unprofitable. Estimates suggest European industry throughout 2022-2025 has permanently lost 5 to 10% of heavy industrial capacity due to high energy costs that aren't expected to return to pre-war levels even as Russian gas is replaced. This is deindustrialization driven by energy costs. Jobs lost throughout European energy-intensive industries during 2022-2025 number in tens or hundreds of thousands. Workers in chemical plants, fertilizer facilities, metal smelting, all affected by production curtailments and closures driven by energy costs. This industrial impact throughout 2022-2025 is real consequence of Russian energy warfare that goes beyond immediate price spikes to permanent economic damage. Now let me show you what Russia did to global oil markets throughout 2022-2025. Russia produces approximately 10 million barrels of oil per day. European sanctions throughout 2022 banned imports of Russian oil by sea with price cap mechanism implemented December 2022 limiting price. Western buyers could pay for Russian oil to $60 per barrel. Russia, throughout 2022-2025, responded by redirecting oil exports from Europe to Asia. China now imports roughly 2+ million barrels per day from Russia. India imports 1.5 to 1.8 million barrels per day. Turkey imports significant volumes. Total Russian oil exports throughout 2024-2025 remain around 8 to 9 million barrels per day, only moderately reduced from pre-war 10+ million. Russia throughout 2022-2025 sells this oil at discounted prices below market rates. Reports suggest Russian oil trades $5.50 per barrel below comparable international grades. This discount costs Russia billions in annual revenue but still generates substantial income. Russia throughout 2022-2025 built shadow fleet of approximately 150 plus tankers to transport oil in ways that evade Western sanctions. These tankers turn off transponders, avoid Western ports, operate under murky ownership, and deliver oil to buyers willing to circumvent sanctions. This shadow fleet throughout 2024-2025 allows Russia to maintain oil exports at near pre-war levels, despite sanctions designed to reduce Russian oil revenue. The sanctions reduced revenue per barrel, but didn't dramatically reduce volume. Let me explain what this means for global energy security going forward. Russia, throughout 2022-2025, demonstrated that major energy exporter is willing to weaponize energy supplies completely, destroying decades of commercial relationships for political objectives. This permanently changed how energy security is understood. Europe throughout 2025-2030 will complete infrastructure to eliminate Russian energy dependence entirely. Final LNG terminals, final pipeline connections, final gas storage expansions. By 2027-2028, Europe will have capability to function with zero Russian energy. But this comes at permanent cost. European energy will be structurally more expensive than when cheap Russian pipeline gas was available. European industry will be less competitive globally. European consumers will pay higher energy costs indefinitely. Russia, throughout 2025-2030, will fully pivot energy exports toward Asia. Pipelines to China will expand. LNG facilities in Russian Far East will grow. Russian energy sector will be oriented toward Beijing instead of Berlin. This reorientation throughout 2025-2030 means even if political relationships eventually normalize, the physical infrastructure and commercial relationships that connected Russian energy to European consumers for decades won't be rebuilt. The divorce is permanent. Global energy markets throughout 2025-2030 will remain more fragmented and politicized than before 2022. Energy isn't just commodity traded globally, but weapon used in geopolitical competition. Every country throughout 2025-2030 will prioritize secure supplies from reliable partners over cheapest possible prices. Now, let me tell you what I think Russia's biggest energy move actually was. Not hypothetical nationalization decree, but the systematic cutoff of gas to Europe throughout 2022-2023 that destroyed $60-80 billion annually in energy trade relationships that took 40-plus years to build. Russia didn't need single dramatic announcement. Russia progressively strangled European gas supplies through technical excuses, maintenance claims, payment disputes, and finally pipeline sabotage or abandonment. Each step seemed like operational issue. Collectively, they destroyed Europe's Russian gas dependence and Russia's European gas market. This was a strategic decision by Russian leadership to accept permanent loss of European energy market worth hundreds of billions over decades in pursuit of political objectives related to Ukraine and Russian sphere of influence. Economic logic would never justify this decision, but Russian leadership throughout 2022-2025 prioritized geopolitics over economics. Europe throughout 2022-2025 had no choice but to replace Russian energy despite enormous costs. The industrial damage, the higher consumer prices, the loss of competitiveness, all are consequences Europe is living with as we close out 2025. Russia's biggest energy move yet wasn't dramatic decree. It was systematic destruction throughout 2022-2025 of European energy relationships through progressive supply cuts, forcing European companies out of Russian investments through regulatory pressure, and accepting permanent loss of European market worth tens of billions annually in exchange for using energy as weapon in geopolitical confrontation. Europe faces immediate consequences throughout 2024 to 2025 of energy costs remaining structurally higher than pre-war period, industrial capacity permanently lost, and necessity of continued massive infrastructure investment to complete replacement of Russian supplies. As 2025 ends, the biggest energy move is 3 years old and continuing. Russia's decision to weaponize energy completely, destroy commercial relationships for political goals, and accept that Russian energy and European consumption are permanently divorced after 4 decades of interdependence that both sides once believed was mutual interest preventing conflict. The move was real. The consequences are permanent. And the energy warfare throughout 2022-2025 reshaped European energy security and global energy markets in ways that will persist for decades, regardless of how the Ukraine conflict eventually resolves.